Understanding the presumption of jurisdiction, a foundation of judicial authority. Introduction, the importance of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the cornerstone of a court's authority to hear and decide a case. Without jurisdiction, whether personal, subject matter, or territorial, a court's rulings are invalid. However, in practice, many courts proceed based on presumptions of jurisdiction that are rarely questioned, particularly in administrative and traffic matters. This lack of scrutiny undermines judicial integrity and constitutional protections. Defining jurisdiction and its types. Subject matter jurisdiction refers to a court's authority to hear specific types of cases, derived from constitutional or statutory provisions. Personal jurisdiction relates to a court's authority over individuals involved in a case, often tied to geographic location or voluntary submission. Territorial jurisdiction, the geographic area where a court has authority. A court must possess all three types of jurisdiction to issue valid decisions. Without these, any rulings can be challenged at any stage. Jurisdiction and constitutional authority. Jurisdiction stems from constitutional and legislative enactments. For example, federal courts derive their authority from Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, while state courts operate under state constitutions and statutory frameworks. Courts often assume jurisdiction based on implied consent, such as residency or engagement in regulated activities, but this presumption is not evidence and must be substantiated when questioned. The presumption of jurisdiction in practice. A. Administrative and traffic courts. In traffic courts, jurisdiction is frequently presumed based on vehicle licensing or registration. These processes are often treated as contracts that imply consent to jurisdiction, but they do not inherently waive constitutional rights. B. The role of voluntary compliance. Applying for licenses or registering vehicles can imply compliance with administrative rules. However, this implied consent often goes unchallenged, allowing courts to assume jurisdiction without evidence. C. Burden of proof. Courts and prosecutors often presume jurisdictional facts are self-evident, bypassing the need for concrete proof. This contradicts established legal principles, such as the Supreme Court ruling in Hagen v. Utah, 1902, which emphasized that jurisdiction must be clearly demonstrated with evidence. Proving jurisdiction, legal standards. To establish jurisdiction, the prosecution must provide documentary evidence, such as statutes, regulations, or contracts proving the court's authority. Factual evidence, specific connections to the jurisdiction, such as residence or activity within the court's geographic area. Mere presence in a courtroom does not equate to consent to jurisdiction, as demonstrated in Pennoyer v. Neff, 1878, where the Supreme Court held that jurisdiction requires explicit and demonstrable authority over the defendant. Challenging the presumption of jurisdiction. A. Questions to ask. Has the prosecution provided documentary evidence of jurisdiction? What statutory or constitutional authority explicitly grants the court jurisdiction over this matter? Has the defendant knowingly consented to the tribunal's authority? B. Legal tools for challenges. Motion to dismiss, argue lack of jurisdiction as grounds for dismissal. Request for proof, demand evidence substantiating jurisdiction. Judicial review, escalate jurisdictional disputes to higher courts if lower tribunals fail to substantiate authority. Constitutional implications of presumed jurisdiction. A. Due process violations. Proceeding without substantiating jurisdiction undermines the Fifth and 14th Amendments, which guarantee that no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. B. Erosion of individual liberties. Unchecked presumptions of jurisdiction enable governmental overreach, especially in administrative and traffic cases, where procedural standards are often relaxed. Reforms and recommendations. A. Shift the burden of proof. Proving jurisdiction should rest unequivocally with the prosecution, requiring clear and convincing evidence before proceedings can continue. B. Educate defendants. Public awareness campaigns and legal education initiatives can empower individuals to recognize and challenge jurisdictional presumptions effectively. C. Judicial oversight. Higher courts must enforce stricter standards for proving jurisdiction to prevent procedural shortcuts in lower tribunals. Conclusion: reaffirming the rule of law. Jurisdiction is not a formality, it is the bedrock of judicial authority. Allowing courts to proceed based on unchallenged presumptions risks eroding constitutional protections and undermining the integrity of the judicial process. By demanding actual evidence to substantiate jurisdiction, defendants can ensure their rights are upheld, while courts must adhere to rigorous evidentiary standards to reaffirm the rule of law. The critical question remains: has the prosecution provided evidence to substantiate the presumption of jurisdiction? Without a clear answer, no court has the authority to proceed.